How do you tell if the world around you has gone mad, or if it's just your mind that's become a jumbled mess? You're gentle, kind, and caring, yet for some reason, everyone around you thinks you're an unbalanced psychopath. Where is that fine line between sanity and madness? And who even defines those boundaries? Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Today's story took place on the night of January 1st, 2021, in the city of Canton, Georgia, in a quiet and peaceful place. Around 2 in the morning, a man named Morgan Metzer appeared at the residence of his ex-wife, Morgan. He approached the house, knocked on the door, but no one answered. The man circled the building, shouting his ex-wife's name. It seemed to him that he heard some noise in the backyard. As soon as Rodney reached the back door, he saw Morgan on the patio, partially undressed, with her hands tied behind her back and a pillowcase pulled over her head. He ran to his ex-wife and, while untying her hands, asked what had happened. Upon hearing that Morgan had been attacked, Rodney immediately called the 911 emergency service. When the police arrived at the house, they saw that the woman had been brutally beaten. According to the victim, she woke up in the middle of the night and saw a stranger in her bedroom doorway, his face hidden by a mask. The assailant struck her with the butt of a pistol, beat her, and tried to strangle her. Morgan even lost consciousness once due to lack of air, but when she came to, she realized the attacker was still nearby. While she was unconscious, the stranger had undressed her and assaulted her lifeless body. The attacker not only threatened to kill Morgan, but also mentioned her ex-husband. After listening to the victim's story, the detectives were still not entirely sure what was troubling them about the situation. Morgan Metzer was a young mother of twin children. She had a thriving business and no real problems. So why would someone do this to her? Who had a reason to torment a woman in such a way? However, the police quickly figured out what had happened, and what they learned shocked them because it was not at all what it seemed at first. Morgan and Rodney Metzer had been together for about 2 decades. They met when Morgan was only 14 years old and Rodney was 17. It was love at first sight. The young couple, swept up in a wave of romantic feelings, didn't notice how quickly everything spiraled. They were both young and perfectly suited for each other. The young man called his beloved nothing less than a princess and tried to treat her accordingly. Everyone around them considered them the perfect couple, so it surprised no one when the two decided to get married in 2010. By that time, they had been together for several years. Morgan was 21 and Rodney was 24. They were young, in love with each other, and newly married. After the wedding ceremony, the newlyweds went on a honeymoon. But when they returned home, they faced post-wedding blues. A sense of disappointment and sadness after the wedding excitement overwhelmed them. Although from the outside it seemed they were happy in their marriage, their happiness didn't last long. At first glance, there were no problems in the Metzer couple's relationship, but life hit them from another angle. Less than a year after their wedding, Rodney's younger brother, who was only 19 years old, died of leukemia. After this event, Rodney changed dramatically. He never recovered from the tragic loss of his younger brother and became a completely different person. It seemed that life had unleashed all its hardships on the young couple. The following year, on March 15, 2011, the Metzers welcomed their first child, a son named Kevin, in honor of Rodney's late brother. Unfortunately, baby Kevin had a congenital heart defect. He lived for just over 2 weeks. Morgan said that during this time she felt as if she were in a fog. It was even hard for her to recall that period of her life because so many tragic events had piled up in such a short time, and it didn't end there. 3 months after the death of baby Kevin, the couple learned of a new pregnancy. They were given a second chance to become parents, this time with twins, which they were overjoyed about. The twins were born in 2012. The birth of the children after so many trials should have been the best time for Morgan and Rodney, but in reality, things were different. The tension between husband and wife was growing. Raising 2 babies at once was undeniably difficult. The parents were exhausted both emotionally and physically, and although to outsiders they still appeared to be the perfect couple, psychological abuse within the family had already begun to take root. Looking back, Morgan admitted that Rodney had always been a manipulator and a gaslighter. The term gaslighting refers to a form of psychological abuse and manipulation in which one person systematically makes another doubt the validity of their perceptions, memories, feelings, and even sanity. Back then, she realized this for the first time. Since the couple had met at a fairly young age for a while, the girl considered her partner's strange behaviors to be trivial. She didn't want to take off her rose-colored glasses, and she had no experience with other men. But now, with the arrival of the children, Morgan clearly realized the tragedy of her choice. Rodney blamed Morgan for everything. For example, he scolded her for forgetting to pick up the kids from daycare, even though he had planned to do it the day before. No matter what happened, Morgan received a dose of accusations from her husband, making her believe she was a bad wife and mother. And this became the beginning of the end of their marriage. When the twins were 2 years old, Rodney lost his job. Although he worked in various places, his main activity was trading, through which he actually lost a lot of money. At the same time, as his career was falling apart, Morgan was thriving. Everything was going great for her. She opened her own interior design company and quickly became the family's main breadwinner. Business was going so well that Morgan even hired several employees, including her best friend Nicole, and won a city contest for the best interior design in 2020. The more Morgan's company flourished, the worse Rodney's behavior became, and the darkest sides of his character surfaced. Physical and psychological abuse in the family became much more apparent. Although Rodney had always tried to appear kind and attentive, at least in public, defending women's rights and despising anyone who showed aggression toward women. Now, however, he was becoming the aggressor himself. One weekend, the Metzers were vacationing at a lake with friends when they started arguing. To avoid ruining the trip for the other couples, Morgan and Rodney returned to their cabin, where the argument continued. That night, the man hit his wife for the first time. This came as a complete shock to Morgan because it contradicted all the principles Rodney had previously stood for. He even refused to watch movies if he knew the main character would be physically harmed. After that altercation in the cabin, Morgan realized her husband had crossed a line from which there was no return. If before it had been limited to shouting and accusations, now fists were involved. The woman decided it was time to escape the situation. She called her father and asked him to come and take her and the children. Strangely, when family, friends, and loved ones learned what had happened, Rodney denied everything. Somehow he managed to convince relatives and friends that he wasn't to blame and that Morgan had injured herself. According to him, during their argument, his wife was so upset that she fell into a hysteria, started screaming hysterically, and hit herself in the face. The only way he could have hurt her was by restraining her so tightly that it might have left bruises. Although Morgan was a fragile woman, in her hysteria, it was as if a demon had possessed her, and she behaved like a madwoman. The worst part of this situation was that Rodney managed to convince even Morgan of his version, not immediately, but she eventually believed that she had inflicted all those injuries on herself during a fit, and he, as a loving husband, was only trying to stop her. Morgan's friend, who understood that Rodney was a skilled manipulator, was very upset and worried. She didn't know what to do or how to help, and from that moment, Morgan's life went downhill. She began to doubt her own reality because her husband constantly told her that all the family's problems were her fault. Rodney would start an argument and then insist that Morgan had provoked him. He also tried to convince the children that their mother was a bad person, that she was aggressive, toxic, and only loved herself. At one point, during another argument, Rodney stumbled and fell down the stairs. He told the children and relatives that Morgan had pushed him down the steps. The woman felt like she was going insane. She knew she wasn't to blame. But her husband made her believe that the fall down the stairs wasn't accidental, that she had pushed him and then tried to block out the unpleasant episode. The family's relationships were crumbling. Her husband controlled Morgan's every move, insulted her, and didn't accept the word no. If she tried to refuse him intimacy, he would force himself on her. It's unknown how it all would have ended, but in 2020, Morgan finally realized she needed to save herself and her children. She gathered her strength and filed for divorce, which was finalized in December. After separating from her husband, the woman finally found peace and could move forward. But that didn't mean Rodney completely disappeared from her life. They still had children together. Although the couple no longer lived under the same roof, for the sake of the children, they decided to maintain friendly relations. Just before Christmas, Morgan and Rodney traveled together to Florida to take the children to relatives and create an appearance of unity. But Rodney wanted it to be real. They communicated calmly, without any arguments. And now, on the first day of the new year, the man found his ex-wife beaten on the back patio of her home. Morgan Metzer had planned to spend New Year's Eve with her best friend Nicole at her house. They intended to drink wine, prepare snacks, and spend time together while the children were away. But after a couple of glasses, Morgan felt exhausted and prepared to head home. She explained that because of the twins, she was constantly sleep-deprived and was ready to fall asleep at any moment. Of course, Nicole protested at first, but then agreed that the best remedy for anxiety and stress was a good night's sleep. Her friend understood that Morgan had had a very tough year. Frequent arguments with her husband, a divorce, and 2 8-year-old children who constantly demanded attention. With great regret, she let Metzer go, agreeing to meet again soon. Morgan headed home. She was so tired that she even gave up on the idea of celebrating New Year's. Instead, the woman went straight to bed. As a result, at midnight, she was awakened by fireworks and the shouts of neighbors celebrating in the distance. Morgan kissed her dog, jokingly wished herself a happy new year, rolled over, and fell back asleep. The next thing Morgan remembered was suddenly waking up because she sensed someone else in her room. The woman, slightly opening her eyes, scanned the bedroom and noticed a dark figure in the doorway. Her eyes widened in fear when she saw the silhouette of a tall stranger dressed entirely in black, including a mask resembling Batman's. The man stood like a statue with clenched fists. His face wasn't visible because the lit bulb in the hallway only allowed her to see his silhouette. Morgan screamed so loudly that she startled herself with her own cry. But before she could do anything, the man rushed at her, hit her in the face with the butt of a pistol, flipped her onto her stomach, and put plastic zip-tie handcuffs on her wrists. Judging by everything, the handcuffs had been prepared in advance specifically for Morgan. The stranger mostly acted in silence, but then said that Morgan had done something wrong and would regret it. All these phrases were spoken in a strange voice. The attacker was clearly trying to alter his voice to be unrecognizable, likely using some kind of voice-changing device. Perhaps Morgan knew this person, but she didn't have time to think because the blows kept coming. Then the assailant grabbed her by the throat and began to squeeze. The woman lost consciousness, then came to and realized her body had been used against her will. All she could think about at that moment was who would take care of the children if she were no longer alive. Morgan didn't have a will, hadn't discussed this with her parents, and hadn't explained to the twins what death was. She wasn't ready to die at that moment, and perhaps that's what saved her. Morgan tried to detach herself from what was happening, to push aside the feelings of shame and helplessness. She searched for ways to escape and thought about who she might have crossed. Her mind was like a computer with thousands of tabs open, none of which were loading. In reality, Metzer couldn't name anyone who would come to her house and start tormenting her. The whole time, a thought gnawed at her that she knew the attacker. There was something familiar in his movements. Moreover, the assailant knew details of Morgan's life. Despite the fact that Metzer was home alone, the criminal stated that she would miss her husband and children. And suddenly, in that very moment, realization hit. Now Morgan knew who was hiding under the Batman mask. Without a doubt, it was Rodney, her ex-husband. With every new phrase he uttered in his altered voice, her suspicion was confirmed. And this knowledge helped her stay alive. Morgan didn't let on that she had figured out Rodney's criminal plan. She simply began begging him not to harm her husband because she still loved him. It worked instantly. The attacker loosened his grip. His aggression seemed to dissolve into the air. He even tried to be gentler with Morgan. At that moment, the woman realized she would live. Finally, the assailant backed off from his victim and searched the room for valuables. He started rummaging through drawers, opening cabinets, and then demanded Morgan's mobile phone to access the security system and delete the footage from the cameras located on the property. After dealing with the security system and turning the house upside down, the criminal took a pillowcase and put it over the victim's head. Then he lifted her from the bed and led her to the backyard, ordering her to lie still and not move until she heard a car horn. Morgan's hands were tied behind her back, and she was partially undressed. The woman couldn't see what was happening around her, whether the man in the Batman costume had left or was watching her from a distance. So she lay there and waited for the signal. Her eyes were covered by the pillowcase, which prevented her from looking around. Time moved very slowly, and it was unclear whether a minute had passed or several hours. The Metzer house was in a fairly remote location. There was beautiful nature, hills where you could walk with the children, but there were no neighbors nearby. For once, Morgan regretted that her house was isolated from others. More than half an hour passed before she heard some noise. It was footsteps. Someone was approaching the back porch. Morgan tensed, thinking she had been wrong in her guesses and that the criminal had returned to finish her off. But then she heard Rodney's voice, her ex-husband, who was genuinely frightened for the life and health of the mother of his children. After hearing Morgan's brief story, Rodney called 911 and reported that a break-in had occurred and that he had found his ex-wife beaten, with her hands tied and a pillowcase over her head. While the two of them waited for the police, Rodney comforted his ex-wife as she was having a real breakdown. She begged him over and over not to leave her alone, and he was delighted that Morgan still loved him and needed his care. However, the woman had entirely different thoughts in her mind, because now she was more than certain that it was Rodney who had attacked her, dressed in a costume resembling Batman's. Morgan didn't want the police to waste time searching for the criminal. The law enforcement officers dispatched to the Metzer house arrived around 2 in the morning. Rodney's behavior immediately seemed strange to them. The coincidence was too obvious. How was it that the ex-husband showed up at his ex-wife's house right after she was attacked? When questioned by the detectives, the man explained that he had been at his apartment, as they had recently finalized their divorce. Then he heard someone knock on the glass and say Morgan's name. Rodney looked out the window but saw no one. For some reason, this threw him off, and he tried calling his ex-wife, but she didn't answer. This worried him even more, so he decided to go check on her. It wasn't difficult, as Rodney lived 12 minutes away from Morgan's house, and although they were divorced, this woman still mattered to him. The initial examination of the victim's condition clearly showed that this attack was committed by an angry, emotional person who surely had a connection to Morgan Metzer, not some random burglar who broke into her home. The woman was severely beaten. She had been struck in the face multiple times, so much so that one eye was swollen shut. The sexual assault also indicated that the crime was personal. As soon as the victim was alone with the detectives, she told them about her suspicions that her ex-husband, her wonderful rescuer, was actually the one who had committed the attack. Although he used some device to change his voice, she recognized him by his words. The attacker had said that Morgan would miss her husband, and as soon as she played along, the assailant began behaving entirely differently. Also, when the criminal lifted her from the bed to lead her to the porch, it felt familiar to Morgan because when she was pregnant with the twins, Rodney would often help her get out of bed. She simply recognized her husband's touch. After all, they had been together for nearly 2 decades. And when her ex-husband appeared before Morgan as her savior, she was afraid to let him know that she knew who had attacked her, as he surely wouldn't have let her live. A divorce, emotionally, can be compared to the tragic death of a loved one. It's hard for both spouses to go through, regardless of who initiated it. But it's especially difficult for someone who suddenly loses control over a partner they manipulated and insulted for years. This is the most dangerous time for a woman when she ends a relationship with an abuser. In the last weeks of December 2020, Rodney was receiving one piece of bad news after another. First, there was the divorce. Then he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. His younger brother had died of leukemia, and his father had also been diagnosed with cancer. This terrible news plunged him into despair. The man called his ex-wife and told her about his diagnosis. He even showed her a doctor's report. Morgan felt great sympathy for Rodney and extended a helping hand. She even let him sleep on the couch in the living room because the person close to her was in a very depressed state and needed emotional support at the time. The care she showed made him feel that he had made a mistake by agreeing to the divorce. The man began begging his wife to return and give him another chance. However, Morgan said she wasn't interested and asked him to leave. She advised him to turn to his parents and tell them everything, as she no longer wanted to be Rodney's support. Their relationship was over, and the woman didn't want to give false hopes. After that conversation, Rodney returned to his apartment but didn't calm down. He kept writing to Morgan repeatedly, insisting they should be together, at least for the children, and that she should take him back. The man even agreed to take on the responsibility of providing for the family financially and suggested Morgan quit her job. But that wasn't the life the woman, who had just gained independence, dreamed of. Besides, Metzer loved her job. On New Year's Eve, Rodney went to his ex-wife's house while she was at her friend Nicole's and placed a check for $60,000 under her door. Before that, he photographed the check, sent Morgan the picture, and said she deserved everything he had. By the way, the check wasn't found in the house, as the burglar took it. Before this, Morgan had explained to her ex-husband that she was going to her parents for New Year's and would spend the night there. She threatened to turn off her phone if he didn't stop messaging her. So the check for a large sum was likely just an attempt to lure Morgan back home. Later, the police checked Rodney's accounts, and he simply didn't have that money, so the check was another fake, a manipulation tactic. Morgan's greatest fear was that the detectives wouldn't take her words seriously, wouldn't believe what she said. This woman had spent years in doubt. Rodney had a special gift for persuasion, making her, her friends, and her family believe that Morgan was unstable, aggressive, and emotionally unrestrained. The woman was stunned to hear that the officers agreed with her suspicions. At that moment, she felt as if she had melted because she was finally heard and understood. That hadn't happened in years. No one saw what Morgan had been through all those years. No one listened to her words. The detectives decided to double-check the story Rodney had told them. First, they seized his phone and found a folder with photos of Morgan. In some, she was partially undressed. In others, completely naked. The woman wasn't looking at the camera and seemed unaware she was being photographed. It turned out the pictures were taken during the week Rodney was sleeping on the couch at his ex-wife's house. He had secretly photographed her on his phone while she was showering or changing. Additionally, the man had checked his ex-wife's phone without permission, looked through her correspondence with others, and taken pictures of her screen. When the woman learned about this from the police, she was in complete shock. She was, quite literally, filled with rage toward her ex-husband. Despite Morgan's words and the police's suspicions about Rodney Metzer, they didn't yet have evidence that he was the one who orchestrated the New Year's Eve attack. To prevent the man from disposing of evidence, he was arrested for invasion of privacy, for taking photos of Morgan without her consent. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. Detectives obtained a warrant to search the suspect's apartment and car, where they found evidence linking Rodney to the crime. Among them were a pistol found in his car and zip ties in his apartment, similar to those used during the attack. Investigators also obtained surveillance footage from a store showing the man purchasing those zip ties. Metzer bought the future handcuffs on December 30th, 36 hours before the attack, and used his debit card to pay, although he later claimed he hadn't bought anything. Other significant evidence included Rodney Metzer's internet search history. He had been acting suspiciously, searching for information on how long one could starve to death, how to change one's voice, and how long it takes to strangle someone to unconsciousness. Also found in his apartment was a book titled 7 Ways to Become Her Hero, the one your wife has been waiting for. All this pointed to a planned attack. Only one thing was stolen from Morgan's house, her mobile phone through which the surveillance camera footage from the property was deleted. It's unlikely a stranger would know how to access the recordings unless they were familiar with the security system. It also turned out that the pancreatic cancer diagnosis Rodney had supposedly received from the hospital was fake. It was another harsh manipulation tactic to regain his ex-wife's sympathy. The man had made it all up to get Morgan's compassion. After his arrest, Rodney confessed that he had planned to save the family. When the divorce was finalized, Morgan began distancing herself from him, and he didn't want to lose her for good. The police suggested that by orchestrating the attack on his own wife, Metzer had several goals. First, Rodney wanted to make her feel she was in danger without him. Second, he wanted to be her savior. However, there are plenty of cases where attempts to win back an ex-partner end in death. And in Morgan's case, things could have ended far more tragically. Examining the evidence in this case, detectives discovered that Rodney's plan was far worse than investigators had initially thought. Metzer didn't deny that he had searched the internet for ways to change his voice, but explained it by saying he thought his voice wasn't masculine enough. Rodney pretended to be shocked by what happened to Morgan. He assured the police he had nothing to do with it because he was very kind and gentle by nature. The assistant district attorney called Rodney Metzer a master manipulator. In the days leading up to the attack, he forged a doctor's report and faked cancer to gain sympathy from his ex-wife. When that didn't work, the man devised an intricate plan aimed at taking Morgan's life. Rodney's attack could have been even more brutal, as investigators found his suicide note, which implied that he initially planned to kill his ex-wife and then take his own life. The man didn't care that their children would be left orphans. However, for some reason, he deviated from his original plan, perhaps when he heard that Morgan still loved him. After that, Rodney came up with a rescue plan. Fortunately, the sheriff's office investigators quickly unraveled the cunning scheme. A surveillance camera in the residential complex captured Rodney Metzer returning to his apartment shortly after the attack on Morgan. He looked exhausted, disheveled, and was clearly in a hurry. A few minutes later, the man appeared on camera again, but now he looked completely different, in clean clothes with a bag in his hand. Perhaps the bag contained some evidence from the crime scene that Rodney disposed of along the way. It was never found. Ultimately, Rodney Metzer was charged with a long list of crimes, including sexual assault, kidnapping, home invasion, possession of a firearm, and domestic violence with aggravating circumstances. He was held in custody without the possibility of bail. Those who knew Rodney were in shock. His mother, whom he called 2 days after his arrest, was stunned and couldn't believe her son could be accused of such a thing. Moreover, Rodney himself told his mother that he would never have done it and genuinely didn't understand why Morgan had treated him this way. She accused him of the attack, even though he had only come to save her. In reality, when the worst was over, Morgan began to doubt herself. Even after the police found irrefutable evidence, the woman, accustomed to being blamed for everything, asked herself questions. Could it really not have been him? Could someone else have committed the attack? She genuinely wavered and couldn't come to terms with the fact that the man she had lived with for so many years could have tried to take her life. The twins were still with relatives in Florida. Morgan didn't want the children to see her with bruises and wasn't ready to answer the questions they would inevitably have. Besides, she needed to prepare for a serious conversation and somehow explained to the twins that their father would no longer be around. They were only about 9 years old, and parting with their dad could be painful. Although the victims survived, the consequences of the attack were severe. Morgan couldn't sleep for months. She struggled with nightmares in which she heard an unnatural mechanical voice and saw a stranger in a strange outfit resembling Batman's, who then suddenly turned into her ex-husband. In the first few weeks after the incident, she often kept her twin children at home instead of taking them to school because she was simply afraid to be alone in the house and needed the twins to be near her. At first, Rodney tried to convince the police of his innocence and manipulate them, just as he had manipulated his wife for years. But then, to avoid a lengthy trial and resolve the case faster, he was offered a plea deal. Naturally, he agreed. 8 months after the attack, on August 4, 2021, Rodney Metzer pleaded guilty to 14 charges related to the attack on Morgan Metzer and the photos taken without her consent. During the hearing, the woman was finally able to tell her ex-husband everything that had built up inside her. Her victim impact statement was a way to show the world who her husband really was, to let people open their eyes and see the real Rodney. Because for years, no one noticed his manipulations, and no one ever believed he was a bad person. Morgan said that as horrific as the attack was, it at least finally revealed his true face. And it was the attack that became a relief for her and the first step toward a new, free life. Rodney Metzer was sentenced to 70 years in prison, of which he must serve 25 years in incarceration, with the remainder on probation as part of the plea deal. The prisoner refused visits from loved ones for a long time because he was ashamed of his actions. He was especially ashamed in front of his parents, who had lost their younger son to leukemia, as Rodney, by lying about his diagnosis, forced them to relive painful moments. Metzer has long suffered from type 1 diabetes, and his health has rapidly deteriorated since he's been in prison. As for Morgan, she took steps toward recovery, underwent therapy, and focused on raising her children. She also devotes a lot of time to helping others who have found themselves in similar situations. The Morgan Metzer case was adapted into a film called My Husband is Stalking Me. Her story was also adapted into a film titled My Husband, the Gaslighter, the Morgan Metzer story. The woman wants to share her painful experience with as many people as possible. Morgan still receives letters from women who have faced similar situations and tries to help them rebuild their lives. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.